On the 14th of March, 1861, in a cramped municipal office on Chambers Street in Lower Manhattan, a junior clerk named Thomas Hadley discovered something that contradicted every property assessment he had processed in his 3 years of employment. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that made ink sluggish in its well. Through the tall windows behind him, pale light filtered through industrial smoke that hung over the harbor like a permanent fog. He had been tasked with reconciling property valuations for a row of commercial buildings on Pearl Street, structures that had stood since the 1820s, their foundations settled into landfill that had once been East River, shallows. The ledger before him, bound in cracked leather with a spine that crackled when opened, listed the ground floor retail spaces of number 47 Pearl Street as basement-level, subterranean occupancy. Yet Hadley had walked past to that building every morning for a year. The shops opened directly onto the street. Their thresholds sat flush with the cobblestones. Nothing about them was underground. He turned to the assessment from 1858. That entry described the same spaces as ground floor, street-level commercial. The language was clear, the classification standard. 3 years earlier, the city's record keepers had known exactly what they were looking at. But now, in fresh ink dated January 1861, someone had rewritten reality. The ground had become a basement. The surface had been reclassified as subterranean. No explanation accompanied the change. No marginal note justified the new terminology. The street level had simply been declared underground. Hadley pulled another ledger from the shelf behind him, its pages releasing the scent of old linen paper and iron gall ink. This one covered the blocks between Wall Street and Maiden Lane. He found the same pattern. Buildings assessed in 1859 with ground floor mercantile space were now listed with basement-level shops, below-grade access. Yet these structures had not sunk. The streets had not risen. The buildings stood exactly as they had for decades, their doorways opening at sidewalk height, their windows admitting light from street level, their floors requiring no descent from the public thoroughfare. A pattern began to emerge as he worked through the afternoon, the daylight fading to a thin gray wash against the window panes. Block after block, building after building, the ground floors of Lower Manhattan were being systematically reclassified as basements. The change appeared to have begun in late 1860 and accelerated through the winter months. By March 1861, hundreds of commercial properties bore the new designation. The official record now insisted that merchants were conducting business underground, in spaces that any pedestrian could see were flush with the street. The discrepancy had immediate financial implications. Basement space was assessed at a lower rate than ground floor space. The reclassification meant reduced property valuations, which meant reduced tax revenue for a city already straining under the costs of rapid expansion. Yet someone in the assessor's office had authorized the change. Multiple clerks had implemented it, rewriting entry after entry in fresh ink, backdating assessments, creating a new reality in the official archive. Hadley found a notation in the margin of a ledger dated December 1860. The handwriting was cramped, the ink a different shade than the main entries. Added later, perhaps months later. It read, "Ground level revised per municipal standard, reference elevation datum, City Surveyor Directive 1860-11. The phrase meant nothing to him. He had never heard of an elevation datum directive. No such document had crossed his desk. Yet, here it was, cited as authority for redefining the surface of the earth. Outside, rain began to fall, striking the window panes with a sound like scattered pins. The gas lamps were lit early, their yellow glow creating pools of light across the office's wooden floors. Hadley closed the ledgers and returned them to their shelves, the spines aligned in neat rows that gave no hint of the contradiction they contained. He wrote nothing in the day's log about his discovery. The city's official record had spoken. The ground floors had become basements. Reality, it seemed, was negotiable. In the months that followed, the reclassification spread beyond Lower Manhattan. By June 1861, property records in Brooklyn Heights showed the same transformation. Buildings on Montague Street and Pierpont Street, their ground floors opening directly onto elevated residential blocks with views across the harbor, were now listed as having basement-level primary access. In Williamsburg, industrial structures with loading bays at street level were reassessed as subterranean warehouse space, below-grade operations. The ground was sinking in the ledgers, even as the physical city remained unchanged. A surveyor named Edward Harrison noticed the discrepancy in August 1861, while preparing elevation maps for a proposed water main extension along Broadway. His instruments were precise: a theodolite manufactured in London, its brass fittings gleaming even in the diffuse light of an overcast morning. He established a benchmark on the granite steps of City Hall, measured the vertical angle to Broadway's pavement, and calculated the grade. Then he consulted the property records to verify the depth of existing cellars beneath the thoroughfare. The assessments claimed that Broadway's ground floor businesses were operating in basement spaces, which would place their floors several feet below street level. Yet his measurements showed otherwise. The floors were level with the street. The basements, where they existed, were a full story lower. Harrison documented the contradiction in his field notes. The measurements were absolute. The physical world could not lie. Yet the official record insisted on a different truth. He noted the date, August 23rd, 1861. And the weather, a humid stillness that made the paper damp to the touch. He noted the benchmark elevation, the instrument angles, the calculated heights. Then he wrote, "Assessment designations do not correspond to surveyed elevations. Ground floors designated as basements despite being at grade. Discrepancy systematic, not isolated error." His report was filed with the city surveyor's office and promptly archived without comment. Under this video, you'll see a thanks button, a small gesture with a big meaning. By pressing it, you're not only supporting the creation of more content like this, but you're also becoming part of the very exchange we've been talking about, giving and receiving in harmony. It's not about the size of the gesture, it's about the meaning. A simple super thanks tells me these words reached you. It tells me that the effort, the late nights, and the discipline to bring this message forward, that it mattered to someone on the other side of the screen. No revision of the property records followed. No explanation was issued. The ground floors remained basements in the official record, while Harrison's measurements collected dust in a wooden filing cabinet that would not be opened again for decades. The change was not confined to New York. By the autumn of 1861, property records in Boston showed similar reclassifications. Buildings along Tremont Street and Washington Street, their ground floors accessible directly from the brick sidewalks, were being assessed as having basement-level commercial occupancy. In Philadelphia, structures on Market Street and Chestnut Street underwent the same transformation. The ground was becoming subterranean across American cities, all within the same narrow window of time, all with the same absence of explanation. A clerk in Boston's assessor's office, writing in a personal diary dated October 12, 1861, noted, "Told today to revise all assessments per new standard. Ground floor to be called basement if principal access is from street. Makes no sense to me. Basement means below ground, always has. But orders are orders. The whole office is doing the same. No one questions it aloud." The timing was significant. The nation was 6 months into civil war. Federal troops had mobilized, supply chains were disrupted, and cities were adapting to wartime economies. Government offices were preoccupied with conscription lists, war bond sales, and military procurement. Property assessment seemed a minor, administrative detail hardly worth scrutiny. Yet in this moment of national distraction, the fundamental classification of urban space was being rewritten. The implications extended beyond taxation. Building codes and fire regulations referenced floor designations. Insurance policies differentiated between ground floor and basement risk. Lease agreements specified basement rate or ground floor rate for commercial rent. When the ground floor became a basement in the official record, all of these instruments shifted. Merchants found their insurance premiums adjusted. Landlords discovered their tax assessments reduced. Tenants challenged lease terms that now classified their street-level shops as subterranean space. A legal challenge emerged in November 1861. A textile merchant named Samuel Morrison, operating a shop on Broadway at street level, received a revised property assessment that reclassified his space as a basement. His tax burden decreased, but his insurance company used the new designation to argue that his policy, written for ground floor commercial space, no longer applied. The insurer claimed Morrison was now operating in a basement, which carried higher fire risk and required a different premium structure. Morrison argued that his shop had not moved, that nothing physical had changed, that the reclassification was administrative fiction. The case was heard in municipal court on November 28, 1861. The judge reviewed the property records, examined the building itself, and noted the obvious contradiction. Yet, he ruled in favor of the city's assessment. His decision stated, "The designation of floors and their relationship to public grade is a matter of municipal authority. The city's determination of what constitutes ground level versus basement level is conclusive for purposes of assessment and regulation. Physical measurements, while relevant, do not override administrative classification." The ruling established a precedent. The official record could redefine reality. If the city declared that a ground floor was a basement, then legally it was a basement, regardless of physical fact. The ledgers had authority over the theodolite, the document over the measurement, the written word over the tangible world. By December 1861, the reclassification had become standard practice across major American cities. Training manuals for property assessors included new guidance. Street-level commercial space with direct public access may be designated as basement level for assessment purposes when principal occupancy utilizes the lowest above-grade floor. The language was bureaucratic. Time equals 400 milliseconds, greater than nearly incomprehensible, but its effect was clear. Ground floors could be called basements at the assessor's discretion. A memorandum circulated among municipal offices in January 1862, marked internal guidance only, attempted to clarify the policy. It read, "The designation basement for assessment purposes does not indicate subterranean position, but rather functional classification. Spaces serving commercial purposes at the lowest above grade level of a structure may be assessed as basement level, regardless of their relationship to street grade. This designation allows for more accurate valuation of mixed-use properties and standardizes assessment across jurisdictions." The explanation only deepened the mystery. If basement no longer meant below ground, what did it mean? The term had been stripped of its physical referent and transformed into an abstract category. A basement was now defined not by its position relative to the earth, but by its position within a building's internal hierarchy. The lowest above-grade floor became a basement by definition, even if it opened onto the street, even if it sat at sidewalk level, even if it required no descent to enter. The linguistic shift had architectural precedence. In England, the term ground floor had always referred to the lowest level of a building, while the floor above it was called the first floor, a convention that puzzled Americans who used first floor to mean the ground level. But the 1861 American reclassification was different. It did not simply adopt British terminology. It created a new hybrid where ground floors could be simultaneously at grade and designated as basements, where the physical and the administrative occupied separate realities. Engineers and architects noticed other implications. Building plans submitted for approval in 1862 began to show a new labeling convention. The lowest floor, even when at street level, was marked B for basement on the drawings. The floor above it, even when several feet above the sidewalk, was marked 1 for first floor. This created drawings where the ground floor was labeled as if it were underground, where the street level disappeared from the architectural notation, where the building's relationship to the earth became ambiguous in the official representation. A construction foreman, interviewed years later for an oral history project, recalled the confusion. "We'd get the plans, and they'd show basement space where we knew the ground would be. At first we thought it was a drafting error. Then we realized it was intentional. They wanted us to build what looked like a ground floor, but call it a basement in all the paperwork. Made the numbers work better for the owners. Lower assessed value, lower taxes. We just built what we were told and labeled it however they wanted." The practice revealed something about the malleability of official classification. If enough ledgers said the ground floor was a basement, if enough drawings labeled street level as subterranean, if enough clerks and assessors and engineers agreed to use the new terminology, then reality could be overwritten. The physical world remained unchanged, but the documentary world, the world of records and assessments and regulations, transformed completely. By 1863, the reclassification had become so normalized that new clerks entering municipal service learned it as standard procedure, unaware that anything had ever been different. Training materials made no mention of the change. No historical note explained when or why ground floors had become basements. The contradiction was simply how things were done, embedded in practice, beyond question. A textbook for municipal assessors, published in 1865, stated matter-of-factly, "Basement space includes any commercial or residential area occupying the lowest above-grade floor of a structure, regardless of its elevation. Relative to public thoroughfares, Assessment of basement space follows standard below-grade valuation tables. The definition had been codified. The transformation was complete. What had been ground floors in 1858 were now, officially and permanently, basements. The long-term effects rippled through urban development. Buildings constructed in the 1870s and 80s incorporated the classification into their design. Architects planned raised basements, ground floor spaces elevated slightly above the sidewalk, but designated as basements in the official record. This allowed developers to maximize rentable space while maintaining favorable tax assessments. The raised basement became a standard feature of urban commercial architecture, a physical manifestation of the 1861 reclassification. In Brooklyn, entire neighborhoods of brownstone row houses were built with English basements, ground floor apartments accessed via a short flight of stairs below the main stoop. These spaces, clearly at or near street level, were legally designated as basements. Tenants living in them paid basement rates for rent, even as their windows opened directly onto tree-lined streets, even as they required no significant descent from the sidewalk. The term had become divorced from its physical meaning, transformed into a legal and financial category that bore only a distant relationship to the actual position of the space. Insurance companies adapted to the new classification. Fire risk tables distinguished between true basements, below grade, limited egress, and assessment basements, at grade, designated as basement for tax purposes. The linguistic split acknowledged the contradiction while accepting it as permanent. The same space could be a ground floor for fire safety purposes and a basement for taxation purposes, occupying two categories simultaneously depending on which official document was being consulted. The dual classification created strange legal paradoxes. A merchant operating in a basement at street level could be subject to fire codes for ground floor premises, which required certain exit configurations, while simultaneously being assessed taxes as basement space, which carried lower valuations. Disputes arose over which designation took precedence in different contexts. Courts generally ruled that classification was purpose-specific. The same space was whatever the relevant regulations said it was, shifting identity depending on whether the question involved taxation, fire safety, zoning, or insurance. By the 1890s, no one in municipal government questioned why ground floors were called basements. The practice had become naturalized, accepted as simply part of the administrative apparatus of urban management. New generations of clerks, assessors, and building inspectors learned the terminology without learning its history. The transformation that had occurred in 1861 was forgotten, buried in archives that no one consulted. A researcher in 1923, examining 19th century property records for a dissertation on urban taxation, noticed the change and attempted to trace its origins. She found the 1861 reclassifications, the surveyor's contradictory measurements, the court rulings that privileged administrative designation over physical fact. She found no policy document explaining the change, no official directive ordering the transformation, no public debate or legislative action. The shift had occurred in the ordinary work of clerks and assessors, implemented through accumulated small decisions that together rewrote the definition of ground level. Her dissertation, chapter on the topic, was cut by her advisor, who found it too speculative and insufficiently relevant to the central argument about progressive-era tax reform. The research remained in her notes, unpublished. After her death in 1947, her papers were donated to a university library where they sat uncatalogued for decades. Today, in New York City property records, thousands of commercial spaces at street level are still officially designated as basements. The ground floor bakery on Amsterdam Avenue occupies a space classified as basement level commercial. The street level gallery in Chelsea shows art in what the city calls subterranean retail space. The classification affects their tax assessments, their insurance costs, their lease agreements. Yet few owners know why their ground floors are basements, why the terminology contradicts what anyone walking past can plainly see. Modern property databases perpetuate the 1861 classification without explanation. Digital systems imported data from century-old ledgers, converting ink entries into electronic records that now seem authoritative simply because they appear on a screen. The contradiction that confused Thomas Hadley in 1861 persists in automated form, replicated across databases, embedded in algorithms that calculate tax liability and assess building value. If you search property records for basement level in Lower Manhattan today, you will find hundreds of listings for spaces that open directly onto the street. If you ask a city assessor why ground floors are designated as basements, you may receive an explanation about functional classification or historical assessment methodology, terms that acknowledge the practice while obscuring its origin. The transformation that occurred in 1861 has become invisible, naturalized into the ordinary functioning of urban administration. The question that Thomas Hadley could not answer in that cold March office remains unanswered. Why did the ground become subterranean in the ledgers? Why did cities systematically reclassify street-level space as basement space in a brief window during 1861? Why did the change persist, becoming standard practice that continues today? The official records offer no explanation. The physical world contradicts the documentary world, and in the space between them, the mystery endures, written into every property, assessment that calls the ground a basement, preserved in the ordinary language of urban bureaucracy, waiting for someone to notice the contradiction and ask again, when did the surface sink, and why does no one remember?